Sometimes the worst day of your life leads you exactly where you need to be. Annie Holt learned this truth when her groom abandoned her at the altar, leaving her to stumble through a mountain blizzard in her wedding dress. That's when she found Ephraim Lott's cabin. This 62-year-old mountain man had lived alone for 15 years, building a quiet life in the Colorado Rockies. When he saw this broken woman on his doorstep, something stirred in his weathered heart. Annie had been hurt before 2 failed marriages, no children, too much pain for one lifetime. Ephraim offered her shelter, warmth, and something she'd never expected to find again. What happens when 2 people who've given up on love discover it in the most unlikely place? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when Annie Holt's world collapsed. She stood at the altar of St. Mary's Chapel in Cedar Falls, Colorado, watching her fiancé, Marcus Webb's retreating figure, disappear through the heavy wooden doors. The whispers of 60 wedding guests buzzed like angry wasps behind her torn veil, but all she could hear was Marcus's final words echoing in her head. "I can't do this, Annie. You're too much baggage for any man to carry." 2 failed marriages by 35. No children despite years of trying. The kind of woman small-town gossips called unlucky in love, with the particular cruelty reserved for those who dared to keep hoping. Annie had heard it all before, but hearing it from the man who'd promised to love her anyway that cut deeper than any whisper. She'd fled the chapel in her ivory silk dress, ignoring her sister's calls and her mother's tears. The storm outside matched the tempest in her chest as she drove her old Honda up the winding mountain road, not caring where it led. When the car finally slid off the icy asphalt and came to rest against a pine tree, Annie simply got out and started walking. The white satin shoes her grandmother had worn 50 years ago were never meant for hiking through 2 feet of snow, but Annie barely felt the cold seeping through the delicate fabric. 15 miles up that same mountain, Ephraim Lott was splitting firewood behind his cabin when he heard something that made him pause mid-swing. Was that crying? He'd lived alone on this peak for 15 years, and the only sounds that usually reached his ears were whined through pine needles, the distant call of hawks, and the crack of his own axe against seasoned oak. At 62, Ephraim had grown comfortable with solitude. His weathered hands showed the calluses of a man who'd built his life from raw timber and honest sweat. His beard, more silver than brown now, hung halfway down his chest like a badge of his separation from the civilized world below. The lines around his grey eyes spoke of harsh winters and long summers, of watching seasons change from his porch while the world moved on without him. He'd come to these mountains after Martha died, when the silence in their house became too heavy to bear. Their little place in town had held too many echoes to the nursery they'd prepared, but never used, the rocking chair that sat empty by the window, the dreams that died with his wife in that sterile hospital room. So he'd sold everything, bought 300 acres of rocky Colorado wilderness, and built himself a life that hurt less because it expected nothing. The cabin was more cave than house, carved partially into the mountainside itself. Thick log walls kept out the worst of winter's bite, and a massive stone fireplace dominated the main room. Ephraim had built every stick of furniture himself, a solid oak table that could seat 4 but usually held only 1 plate, bookshelves lined with volumes on weather patterns and wildlife tracking, and a chess set he'd carved from mountain ash during his second winter of loneliness. That chess set sat on a small table by the window, pieces positioned mid-game where he'd left them weeks ago. Ephraim had been playing both sides, a habit that started as mental exercise and became a kind of meditation. The White King stood surrounded but not yet defeated, much like Ephraim felt some days when the weight of isolation pressed harder than usual. But tonight, that crying sound pulled him from his comfortable solitude. He followed the voice through the falling snow, his boots sure on paths he'd worn smooth over a decade and a half. What he found made him stop dead in his tracks. A woman in a wedding dress was stumbling through his clearing, her white gown a ghostly beacon against the dark pines. Her veil hung in tatters, caught and torn by low branches. Her dark hair had escaped its careful arrangement and now hung wet against her shoulders. She was shivering so hard he could hear her teeth chattering from 20 feet away. "Ma'am," his voice came out rougher than intended, rusty from days without use. "Ma'am, you're going to freeze to death out here." Annie looked up at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. Even through her tears and exhaustion, Ephraim could see she was beautiful in the way that spoke of inner strength rather than mere features. Her face was heart-shaped with high cheekbones that suggested both determination and vulnerability. But it was her eyes that caught him, deep brown, intelligent, and currently drowning in a grief he recognized all too well. "I don't care," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't care anymore." Something in those words hit Ephraim like a physical blow. He'd said them himself many times during those first dark months after Martha's funeral. He knew the dangerous territory Annie was walking in, the place where cold and despair could steal a person's will to keep fighting. "Well, I care," he said, and surprised himself by meaning it. "Come on inside before you become a popsicle." Annie looked at him properly for the first time, this mountain of a man with kind eyes and work-worn hands extended toward her. Everything about him spoke of capability and solidity, from his flannel shirt stretched across broad shoulders to the way he stood planted in the snow, like he belonged there. He was older, probably her father's age, but there was something in his weathered face that made her trust him instinctively. "I don't even know you," she said, though she was already taking a step toward him. "Name's Ephraim Lott, and you're someone who needs help whether you know it or not." He shrugged out of his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The garment swallowed her small frame, but the warmth was immediate and blessed. "We can do proper introductions by the fire." The cabin's interior was a revelation. What looked primitive from outside revealed itself as carefully crafted comfort within. The stone fireplace threw dancing shadows across walls lined with books, and the scent of wood smoke mixed with something that smelled like home-baked bread. A kettle whistled softly on a wood-burning stove, and everywhere Annie looked, she saw evidence of a life lived deliberately and well. Ephraim guided her to a chair near the fire and disappeared into what she assumed was a bedroom. He returned with a thick quilt that looked handmade, all careful stitches and faded florals. When he wrapped it around her shoulders over his coat, Annie caught a faint scent of lavender and realized this must have belonged to a woman. "My wife's," Ephraim said simply, as if reading her thoughts. "She's been gone 20 years now. Figured she wouldn't mind sharing." Annie pulled the quilt tighter and felt something ease in her chest for the first time all day. "I'm Annie Holt," she said, "and I think I just had the worst day of my life." Ephraim poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing all day and handed her a mug thick enough to warm both hands. "Want to talk about it, or want to sit quiet for a while?" The simple question, offered without judgment or expectation, broke something loose in Annie's chest. She started talking and found she couldn't stop. The words tumbled out like water through a broken dam about Marcus's cruelty, about her failed marriages, about the children she'd never had, and the dreams that seemed to die a little more each year. Ephraim listened without interrupting, occasionally refilling her coffee or adding another log to the fire. When she finally fell silent, the snow had stopped falling outside, and the cabin felt like the most peaceful place on earth. "Sounds like that fellow did you a favor," Ephraim said eventually. "Better to find out he's a coward before you tie your life to his than after." Annie looked up at him, surprised. "Everyone else will say I should have seen it coming. Third time's the charm gone wrong. Everyone else doesn't know what they're talking about." Ephraim's voice carried a certainty that made Annie believe him. "Some folks just take longer to find where they belong. Doesn't make them broken, makes them careful." Something in his tone suggested he spoke from experience, and Annie found herself studying his face in the firelight. The lines around his eyes spoke of laughter as well as sorrow, and his hands, wrapped around his own coffee mug, looked capable of building worlds or holding them gently when they threatened to fall apart. "What happened to your wife?" she asked softly. Childbirth, Ephraim said simply. Lost them both in one night, Martha and our son. Doctors said it was one of those things that just happens sometimes, but knowing that didn't make it hurt less. He was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. I came up here because I figured if I was going to be alone, might as well be alone somewhere beautiful. Do you ever get lonely? Ephraim considered this seriously. Lonely and alone aren't the same thing. I've been alone by choice for 15 years, but tonight, he looked at her across the firelight. Tonight I remember what it feels like to have someone to talk to. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in pristine white. Inside the cabin, two wounded souls sat by the fire, finding unexpected comfort in shared silence and the gradual warming of hearts that had forgotten how to hope. Dawn came slowly to the mountain, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Annie woke on Ephraim's couch, still wrapped in Martha's quilt, and for a moment couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day crashed over her like an avalanche, and she sat up with a gasp that brought tears to her eyes. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft crackling of embers in the fireplace. Ephraim was nowhere to be seen, but a fresh cup of coffee sat steaming on the table beside her, along with a plate of what looked like homemade biscuits and wild berry jam. A folded piece of paper leaned against the coffee cup, with her name written in careful block letters. "Gone to check the generator," the note read. "Help yourself to breakfast. There's a spare room upstairs if you want to clean up. Take your time deciding what comes next." Annie held the note for a long moment, struck by the simple kindness of it. When was the last time someone had told her to take her time with anything? Her whole life felt like a series of rushed decisions and other people's expectations. Even yesterday's wedding had been planned according to Marcus's timeline, his preferences, his vision of what their life should look like. She climbed the narrow stairs to find a small but comfortable room with a single bed covered in another of Martha's quilts. A wash basin sat on a simple dresser, with towels folded neatly beside it. But what stopped Annie's breath was the wedding ring still circling her finger, a modest diamond solitaire that Marcus had chosen without consulting her, claiming he knew what she'd like. She twisted the ring off her finger and stared at it in her palm. Such a small thing to represent such large promises, all of them broken now. The diamond caught the morning light, streaming through the window, casting tiny rainbows on the log walls, but Annie felt nothing but hollow relief as she slipped the ring into her pocket. When Ephraim returned an hour later, he found Annie dressed in her wedding gown but with her hair combed and her face washed. She was sitting at his oak table, the wedding ring placed precisely in the center, like an offering or a surrender. "I need to tell you something," she said without preamble, "about why Marcus left me at the altar." Ephraim poured himself coffee and sat across from her, his weathered hands steady on his mug. "You don't owe me explanations, Annie." "Maybe not, but you opened your home to a stranger. You deserve to know what kind of trouble you might be harboring." Annie's voice was steadier than she felt. "He said I was damaged goods. Too much baggage for any decent man to carry." The words hung in the air between them like a poison cloud. Ephraim's jaw tightened, and Annie saw his knuckles whiten around his coffee cup. "What kind of baggage?" His voice was carefully controlled. Annie took a shaky breath. "2 failed marriages before I turned 30. The first one was college sweethearts who grew apart. The second was—" She paused, gathering courage. "He hit me. Just once, but once was enough. I left that same night with nothing but the clothes on my back." Ephraim set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "And the children?" "There are no children." The words came out barely above a whisper. "We tried for years with both husbands. Tests, treatments, specialists. Turns out I can't have babies. Something about scarred fallopian tubes from an infection I had as a teenager." The doctors used words like unlikely and nearly impossible, but what they meant was broken. Annie looked up to find Ephraim watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Marcus knew all this when he proposed, said it didn't matter, that we'd adopt or just be happy with each other. But yesterday, when it came time to actually say the words, he couldn't do it. said he deserved a woman who could give him children, who didn't come with so much history and heartbreak. So he left you at the altar rather than be honest about his feelings before the wedding? Ephraim's voice carried a dangerous edge. He said he'd tried to love me despite everything, but he couldn't pretend anymore. Said I should understand that any man would want a fresh start, not someone who'd already failed twice at the most basic thing a woman is supposed to do. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the mantel and the soft whisper of wind through the pine trees outside. Ephraim stood abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders rigid with controlled anger. "That man's a fool and a coward," he said finally, "and if I ever see him, I'll tell him so." Annie blinked in surprise. "You don't think he was right? That I'm too much trouble?" Ephraim turned from the window, and the intensity in his grey eyes made Annie's breath catch. "I think Marcus Webb doesn't deserve to speak your name, let alone judge your worth. I think any man who'd humiliate a woman like that in front of God and everybody is lower than pond scum, and I think you're well rid of him." The fierce protectiveness in his voice stirred something in Annie's chest. She hadn't felt in years the sense that someone was truly on her side, without conditions or expectations. "My first husband said I was too young to know my own mind," she said quietly. "My second husband said I was too stubborn for my own good. Marcus said I was too damaged to be worth loving. Maybe they were all right. Maybe they were all wrong." Ephraim returned to his chair and reached across the table to cover her hand with his own. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "Maybe you just hadn't found the right person to see who you really are." Annie stared down at their joined handshes, weathered and scarred from years of mountain living, hers pale and soft from office work and city life. They looked like they belonged to different worlds, but somehow the connection felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years. "I don't know who I really am," she admitted. "I've spent so long trying to be what other people wanted that I've lost track of my own shape. Then maybe it's time to find out." Ephraim's thumb traced gently across her knuckles. "Mountains have a way of showing folks their true selves. All the pretense gets stripped away up here, too cold and too quiet for lies to survive long." Annie looked around the cabin with new eyes. Everything she saw spoke of authenticity, handmade furniture that prioritized function over fashion, books chosen for knowledge rather than appearance, a life built on honest work and genuine choices rather than social expectations. "I should probably go back to town," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Face the music, deal with the aftermath. My sister will be worried sick, and my mother will want to plan damage control." "Probably," Ephraim agreed, "but should and want are different animals entirely. What if I don't want to go back? What if I'm tired of explaining myself to people who've already decided what they think of me?" "Then don't go back. Not yet, anyway." Annie looked up sharply. "You can't mean that. You don't even know me. I could be crazy or dangerous or—" "You could be," Ephraim said with a slight smile. "But I don't think you are. I think you're a woman who's been told she's not enough. So many times she's started to believe it. And I think maybe what you need is some time to remember who you were before other folks started trying to reshape you." The offer hung between them like a bridge Annie could choose to cross or burn. Everything in her practical, responsible mind said she should thank him politely, call her sister to come pick her up, and return to Cedar Falls to face whatever consequences awaited her there. But something deeper, something that had been buried under years of trying to be the perfect wife, perfect daughter, perfect woman, whispered that maybe it was time to be imperfect and see what happened. "I don't have anything with me," she said. "No clothes, no money, no. I've got spare clothes that'll fit well enough, and you can earn your keep helping around the place if you're worried about charity." Ephraim's voice was matter-of-fact, as if offering sanctuary to runaway brides was something he did every day. "Question is, what do you want to do?" Annie picked up the wedding ring from the table and studied it one last time. Then, with deliberate ceremony, she walked to the fireplace mantel and set it down among Ephraim's collection of interesting stones and weathered wood. It looked small and insignificant there, just another abandoned thing that had outlived its purpose. "I want to stay," she said, the words feeling like the first honest thing she'd said in years. "At least for a while. If you'll have me." Ephraim's answering smile transformed his weathered face, making him look years younger. "I'll have you, Annie Holt, for as long as you want to stay." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over the Colorado Rockies, warming the snow-covered peaks and promising a day of clear skies and new possibilities. Inside the cabin, two souls who had given up on tomorrow found themselves tentatively planning for next week, next month, maybe even next spring. The wedding ring sat silent on the mantel, a symbol not of failure, but of freedom, the choice to stop trying to fit into spaces too small for the fullness of human hope. Living with Ephraim Lott was like learning a new language once spoken in the subtle shift of wind direction, the angle of morning light through pine branches, and the comfortable silences that stretched between meaningful words. Annie's first week on the mountain passed in a series of small revelations about both the man who'd taken her in and the woman she might become when freed from others' expectations. Ephraim rose before dawn every day, his movements so practiced and quiet that Annie often woke to find coffee already brewing and the fire rekindled to chase away the night's chill. He moved through his morning routine with the efficiency of someone who'd lived alone long enough to eliminate every wasted motion. But Annie noticed he'd started making small accommodations for her presence, brewing extra coffee, leaving a clean towel by the wash basin, setting out an extra plate without asking if she wanted breakfast. "You don't have to wait on me," she told him on her fourth morning, finding him splitting kindling while she was still in her borrowed nightgown known of Martha's that smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar chests. "Not waiting on you," Ephraim replied, his axe landing with practiced precision, "just making room for two where there used to be one. Different thing entirely." Annie studied his profile in the early morning light. Even performing the most mundane tasks, Ephraim moved with a self-contained grace that spoke of deep familiarity with his environment. His hands, scarred from years of working with tools and weather, handled the axe like an extension of his own body. Everything about him suggested competence without arrogance, strength without aggression. "Teach me," she said impulsively. Ephraim paused mid-swing. "Teach you what?" "This, all of it. How to live up here, how to split wood and read weather and," she gestured at the wilderness surrounding them, "how to belong in a place like this." Something shifted in Ephraim's expression, a cautious hope that he quickly schooled into neutrality. "Mountain living's not easy, Annie. It's not some romantic escape from the world below. It's hard work and harder winters, and when things go wrong, you're on your own to fix them. Maybe that's exactly what I need." Annie pulled Martha's quilt tighter around her shoulders. "I've spent my whole adult life depending on other people to solve my problems or tell me who I should be. Maybe it's time I learned to depend on myself." Ephraim studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to gauge her sincerity. Finally, he set down his axe and picked up a smaller piece of wood from the pile. "All right then. First lesson. Wood splitting is about precision, not strength. You find the grain and work with it, not against it. City folks always try to muscle through everything, but the mountain doesn't respond to force, it responds to understanding." He demonstrated the motion, letting the weight of the tool do most of the work, and Annie was struck by how economical his movements were. When he handed her the axe, it felt heavier than she'd expected, but Ephraim's hands covered hers, guiding her grip and stance. "Like this," he murmured, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes. "Feel the balance. The axe wants to fall you, just help it find the right direction." Annie's first attempt sent wood chips flying in all directions and barely dented the log. Her second split the piece cleanly down the middle, and Ephraim's approving nod filled her with a ridiculous sense of accomplishment. "Not bad for a city girl," he said, and there was warmth in his voice that made Annie's chest tighten with something she didn't want to examine too closely. The days that followed established a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Annie proved unexpectedly capable at practical tasks, her small hands nimble with repairs and her attention to detail useful for the countless maintenance chores that mountain living required. She learned to bank the fire at night so it would burn slow and steady until morning, to judge the weather by the color of the sky at sunset, to identify animal tracks in fresh snow. What surprised her most was how much she enjoyed the physical labor. After years of office work that left her feeling disconnected from any tangible results, there was deep satisfaction in splitting a day's worth of kindling or patching a section of roof that had been damaged by winter storms. Her hands developed calluses, her shoulders grew stronger, and for the first time in years, she fell asleep each night feeling genuinely tired, rather than simply exhausted by anxiety and unmet expectations. "You're taking to this better than I expected," Ephraim told her one evening as they sat by the fire. Annie mending a tear in one of his flannel shirts while he worked on replacing a broken handle on a snow shovel. "It feels real," Annie said, searching for words to explain the sense of authenticity she'd found in their simple routines. "Like the work matters in a way that office emails and dinner parties never did. When I patch a hole in the roof, I've fixed something that will actually protect us. When I help you stack firewood, I know we'll be warmer because of it." Ephraim glanced up from his work. "Most folks find the isolation harder to handle than the physical demands." "I thought I would too." Annie finished the mend and held up the shirt to examine her handiwork. The stitches were neat and strong, better than she'd expected. "But I don't feel isolated. I feel—" She paused, trying to find the right word. "Found, I guess. Like I've been looking for this place my whole life without knowing it." The admission hung between them in the firelit quiet, more intimate than Annie had intended. Ephraim's hand stilled on the shovel handle, and when he looked at her, she saw something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. "Annie," he began, then stopped himself. "You should know, you're welcome to stay as long as you want. No expectations, no conditions. I just want that clear between us." There was something in his tone that suggested he was offering more than simple hospitality, but also holding himself carefully back from presuming too much. Annie set down the mended shirt and really looked at him, this man who'd taken in a stranger, asked nothing in return, and somehow made her feel more at home than she had anywhere in years. "What if I don't want there to be no expectations?" she asked softly. Ephraim's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet cabin. "Annie, you've just been through a terrible experience. You're vulnerable right now, and he gestured at himself. "I'm an old man living alone on a mountain. Whatever you're feeling, it might just be gratitude mixed up with proximity." "Don't tell me what I'm feeling," Annie said, but her voice held no anger. "I've had enough of men explaining my emotions to me to last a lifetime." Ephraim had the grace to look chastened. "You're right, I apologize. Besides," Annie continued, moving closer to him on the couch they shared each evening, "you're not that old, and I'm not as young or naive as you seem to think I am." The space between them seemed charged with possibility, but before either could act on it, they were interrupted by the distant sound of engines laboring up the mountain road. Ephraim was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the quick alertness of someone accustomed to unexpected visitors, being either lost tourists or trouble. "Looks like a search party," he said, peering through the glass. "3 vehicles, probably from town." Annie's stomach dropped as she joined him at the window. Even at a distance, she could make out the distinctive shape of her sister Carol's red SUV leading the convoy up the winding road. "They're looking for me," she said unnecessarily. "What do you want to do?" Ephraim asked, and Annie was grateful that he made it her choice rather than assuming she'd want to go back with them. She watched the headlights wind through the pine trees, each curve bringing them closer to a confrontation she wasn't ready for. Down there were all her old obligations, expectations, and the sympathetic but ultimately judgmental questions about what she thought she was doing hiding on a mountain with a man she barely knew. "I want to stay," she said firmly, "but I should at least let them know I'm safe." Ephraim nodded. "I'll make coffee. Something tells me this is going to be a long conversation." As the vehicles pulled into the clearing, Annie straightened her shoulders and prepared to defend a choice she was only beginning to understand herself. Through the window, she could see Carol's worried face behind the windshield, and beside her sat Annie's mother, wearing the expression of barely controlled hysteria that had defined most of Annie's childhood crises. Whatever came next, Annie thought as she watched Ephraim calmly prepare for their unexpected guests, she was no longer the abandoned bride who'd stumbled through the snow in a torn wedding dress. She was someone who could split wood, mend clothes, and choose her own path even when that path led up a mountain toward an uncertain future with a man who treated her choices as her own to make. The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the clearing, followed by Carol's voice calling her name. Annie took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and went to meet whatever consequences awaited her decision to finally choose herself over everyone else's expectations. The confrontation Annie had dreaded turned out to be more complicated than she'd expected. Her sister Carol burst through Ephraim's door with the force of righteous worry, followed by their mother Eleanor, and to Annie's surprise, Father Mackenzie from St. Mary's Chapel. "Annie Marie Holt, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" Carol's voice carried the particular authority of an older sister who'd spent years cleaning up Annie's messes. At 42, Carol was everything Annie had never managed to be: successfully married to the same man for 18 years, mother of 3 well-adjusted children, and pillar of the Cedar Falls community. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and carefully applied makeup looked absurdly out of place in Ephraim's rustic cabin. "I'm drinking coffee and learning to split wood," Annie replied calmly, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Would you like some coffee? Ephraim makes it stronger than you're used to, but it grows on you." Eleanor Holt pushed past her older daughter, her face blotchy with tears and barely contained hysteria. "Sweetheart, we've been worried sick when you didn't answer your phone and your car was found crashed." Her voice broke on the last word. "We thought you were dead in a ditch somewhere." Annie felt a stab of guilt at her mother's genuine distress. She'd been so focused on her own pain that she hadn't considered how her disappearance would affect the people who loved her, however imperfectly. "I'm sorry, Mom, I should have called. I just needed—" She looked around the cabin, trying to find words for what she'd found here. "I needed space to think." "Think about what?" Carol demanded. "Whether you want to completely humiliate our family by running off with some." She gestured at Ephraim, who had remained standing quietly by the coffee pot, letting the women have their say. "Some hermit you don't even know." "I know him well enough," Annie said, surprised by the protective edge that crept into her voice. "He took in a stranger when she needed help, asked nothing in return, and treated her with more respect than she'd gotten from anyone in months. That tells me everything I need to know about his character." Ephraim shot her a grateful look, but when he spoke, his voice was diplomatically neutral. "Perhaps we should all sit down. It's been a long drive up the mountain, and I suspect everyone has things they need to say." Father Mackenzie, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who'd known Annie since her first communion, cleared his throat delicately. "Annie, I understand you've been through a terrible shock. What Marcus did was unconscionable, and I've already had words with him about the cruelty of his timing. But running away isn't the answer to heartbreak." "I didn't run away," Annie said, accepting the cup of coffee Ephraim pressed into her hands. "I walked away. There's a difference." "Is there?" Carol's voice was sharp with frustration. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've lost your mind. You're living in the middle of nowhere with a man you met 3 days ago, wearing clothes that smell like mothballs, and your hands—" She stared at Annie's calloused palms with horror. "What have you been doing to yourself?" Annie looked down at her hands, noting with satisfaction the evidence of honest work, written in small cuts and new strength. "Learning to take care of myself. Learning what I'm actually capable of, when I'm not spending all my energy trying to live up to other people's expectations." "Those aren't other people's expectations," Eleanor said, her voice wavering between tears and anger. "Those are normal expectations. Marriage, family, a stable life in a community where people know and care about you. What you're doing now, this isn't living, it's hiding." The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Annie was hiding, in a way. But she was also discovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of trying to be the daughter, wife, and woman everyone else wanted her to be. "Maybe I needed to hide for a while," she said quietly. "Maybe I needed to find out who I am when I'm not performing for an audience." Ephraim had been listening to the exchange with careful attention, but now he stepped forward with the quiet authority of a man comfortable in his own space. "Mrs. Holt, I understand your concern for your daughter. Any parent would be worried, but Annie's not being held here against her will. She's free to leave any time she chooses. And she should choose that," Carol said firmly. "Annie, this is insane. You're 35 years old, not some teenager running away from home. You have responsibilities, people who depend on you." "What responsibilities?" Annie's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "What people? My job can be done by anyone with basic computer skills. I have no husband, no children, no mortgage, no pets. What exactly am I abandoning besides other people's plans for my life?" The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken family dynamics. Carol had always been the responsible one, the daughter who did everything right and expected the same from her younger sister. Eleanor had spent decades trying to shape Annie into something more conventional, more acceptable to the small-town society that meant everything to her. Father Mackenzie spoke into the quiet. "Annie, I won't pretend to understand what you're going through, but I've seen what isolation can do to people, especially when they're hurting. Human beings are meant for community, for connection. We're not meant to hide away from the world when it disappoints us." "I'm not hiding from the world," Annie said, looking directly at Ephraim. "I'm hiding from a version of the world that never fit me anyway, and I'm not isolated. I have connection. It just doesn't look like what you think it should look like." Ephraim's expression warmed at her words, but he remained diplomatically silent. Annie appreciated that he wasn't trying to defend her choices or speak for her. He was letting her fight her own battles while making it clear by his presence that she wasn't fighting alone. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "Sweetheart, I just want you to be happy. But this, living in a cabin with a man you barely know, doing manual labor like some kind of pioneer woman, this isn't happiness. This is running away from real life." "What if this is real life?" Annie asked. "What if everything I was doing before was the performance? What if this is the first time in years I've felt like myself?" "Then who exactly do you think you are?" Carol demanded. "Because the Annie I know doesn't know a pine tree from an oak tree, can't cook anything more complicated than microwave popcorn, and gets nervous if she has to drive on mountain roads in good weather." Annie felt Ephraim's attention sharpen, and she realized this was the first time he was hearing about the person she'd been before she stumbled into his clearing. The woman Carol described sounded like a stranger to her now, someone weak and dependent, and afraid of everything that required real skill or courage. "Maybe the Annie you know was who I thought I had to be," she said slowly. "Maybe I can be someone different if I'm given the chance to try." Ephraim moved closer to her, close enough that she could feel the solid warmth of his presence at her back. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Miss Holt, your daughter has shown more courage and capability in the past week than many people manage in a lifetime. She's learning skills that will serve her well, no matter where life takes her. That seems like growth, not regression." Carol's eyes narrowed as she really looked at Ephraim for the first time. "And what exactly do you get out of this arrangement? A much younger woman to cook and clean for you in exchange for playing mountain man to her pioneer fantasy." The insult hit its mark, and Annie saw Ephraim's jaw tighten with controlled anger. But before he could respond, Annie stepped between them. "That's enough," she said, her voice carrying a authority that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "You don't get to come into this man's home and question his motives when he's shown me nothing but kindness and respect. And you don't get to reduce what I'm doing here to some kind of domestic arrangement or romantic delusion." She looked around the room at the three people who had come to rescue her from a choice they couldn't understand. "I know you love me. I know you're worried. But I'm not the same woman who got left at the altar 4 days ago. I'm stronger than I was, more capable, more myself. If you can't see that, maybe the problem isn't with my choices." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Father Mackenzie was the first to speak, his voice thoughtful. "I can see changes in you, Annie. You seem steadier somehow, more grounded. I just worry about what happens when winter really sets in, when the novelty wears off." "Then I'll deal with that when it comes," Annie said. "The same way I'll deal with everything else, sown day at a time, making my own choices and living with the consequences." Eleanor stood abruptly, her purse clutched against her chest like armor. "I can't watch this. I can't watch my youngest daughter throw her life away because some man broke her heart." "I'm not throwing my life away, Mum. I'm finally picking it up." But Eleanor was already heading for the door, Carol close behind her. At the threshold, Carol turned back with tears in her eyes. "When this falls apart, and it will, Annie, because fairy tales don't work in real life, and expect us to pick up the pieces again. I've spent 20 years watching you make the same mistakes over and over. I can't do it anymore." The words hit Annie like physical blows, but she stood her ground. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to trust that maybe, for once, I know what I'm doing." After they left, the cabin felt strangely hollow, despite the warmth of the fire and the familiar comfort of Ephraim's presence. Annie sank into her chair, emotionally drained by the confrontation and the weight of bridges that might have been burned beyond repair. "I'm sorry about that," she said quietly. "About what Carol said to you." She was out of line. Ephraim poured himself another cup of coffee and settled beside her. "She's scared for you. People say cruel things when they're scared." "Do you think they're right?" Annie asked. "That I'm running away, playing at something I don't understand?" Ephraim was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I think you're doing something brave and probably necessary. I think you're figuring out who you are when you're not trying to be who everyone else wants you to be. That's not running away, that's growing up, even if it's happening later than some folks might prefer." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "But Annie, they're not entirely wrong about one thing. Winter up here is hard in ways you haven't experienced yet, and this," he gestured between them with his free hand, "this is complicated in ways neither of us has talked about yet." Annie squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the steady warmth of his touch. "Then maybe it's time we started talking about it." Outside, the sound of car engines faded down the mountain road, carrying away the last echoes of Annie's old life. Inside the cabin, two people who'd found unexpected solace in each other's company prepared for the conversations that would define whatever came next. The weeks that followed the family confrontation settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and charged with unspoken possibilities. Annie threw herself into learning everything Ephraim could teach her about mountain life, partly from genuine interest and partly to prove to herself that her choice to stay wasn't the romantic delusion her sister had accused her of harboring. She learned to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, to predict weather changes by the behavior of birds and the smell of the wind. Her hands grew more skilled at practical tasks, patching clothes, preparing meals from basic ingredients, maintaining the wood stove that kept them warm through increasingly cold nights. But it was the healing garden she started behind the cabin that became her greatest source of pride. Martha always wanted an herb garden, Ephraim told her one crisp October morning as they worked together to prepare the soil for Annie's plantings. She had books about it, sketches of how she wanted it laid out, but the baby came early, and then, he shrugged, the gesture encompassing 20 years of abandoned dreams. Annie paused in her digging, struck by the significance of what he was allowing her to build in a space that had remained empty for 2 decades. "Are you sure you're okay with this? I don't want to be planting something where Martha's garden was supposed to grow." Ephraim leaned on his shovel and looked at her with an expression that made her chest tighten. "Martha's been gone 20 years, Annie. I think it's time this ground was used for something that brings life, instead of just holding memories of what never was." The simple statement carried layers of meaning that neither of them addressed directly, but Annie felt the weight of it as she carefully planted chamomile and yarrow, lavender and echinacea. She was creating something new in a space that had been kept empty by grief, and both of them understood the metaphor without speaking it aloud. As autumn deepened into early winter, Annie's confidence in her new life grew along with her physical strength and practical skills. She could split enough firewood to last through a blizzard, could read the sky for storm warnings, could prepare meals that were simple but nourishing from the stores Ephraim had laid in for winter. More importantly, she was discovering aspects of herself that had been buried under years of trying to fit other people's expectations. The woman who had once been afraid to drive mountain roads in good weather now navigated them confidently in Ephraim's old truck, running errands in town, and gradually rebuilding relationships with neighbors who had initially been skeptical of the city woman living with the mountain hermit. She found she had a natural gift for caring for injured animals, and word spread through the community that Annie Holt could set a bird's broken wing or nurse a sick calf back to health. "You've got gentle hands," old Mrs. Henderson told her one snowy afternoon when Annie successfully treated her cat's infected paw. "Some folks are born with the healing touch, and some never learn it no matter how hard they try. You're one of the born ones." The praise meant more to Annie than any compliment she'd received in her previous life. This was recognition for something she was actually good at, not acknowledgement of how well she played a role that never quite fit. But it was in the evenings, when the day's work was done and she and Ephraim sat by the fire reading or playing chess, that Annie felt most completely herself. They had developed an easy intimacy that was both comfortable and charged with growing attraction. Ephraim had been teaching her chess using the set he'd carved years earlier, and Annie proved a quick study at the strategic thinking the game required. "You're getting dangerous," he told her one evening as she captured his queen with a move he hadn't seen coming. "Another few weeks and you'll be beating me regularly." "Is that a threat or a promise?" Annie asked, moving closer to him on the couch to study the board. The firelight caught the silver threads in his beard and deepened the lines around his eyes that spoke of years of weather and laughter. "Depends on whether you're planning to get overconfident," Ephraim replied. But his attention wasn't on the chess game anymore. It was on the way Annie's dark hair caught the firelight, the way her eyes sparkled with intelligence and growing confidence. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Annie could feel the warmth radiating from Ephraim's body, could smell the clean scent of soap and wood smoke that she'd come to associate with home. When she looked up and met his eyes, she saw her own growing feelings reflected the desire, tempered with caution, hope shadowed by the awareness that they were venturing into complicated territory. "Ephraim," she began, not sure what she wanted to say, but knowing the time had come to acknowledge what was building between them. Before she could continue, they were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle climbing the mountain road. Ephraim was instantly alert, moving to the window with the quick wariness of someone accustomed to solitude. "Expecting anyone?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. Annie joined him at the window and felt her stomach drop when she recognized the expensive sedan navigating the rough mountain road. "That's my brother-in-law's car, Tom's car." The significance wasn't lost on either of them. Tom was Carol's husband, a successful businessman who served as the family's voice of reason in times of crisis. If he was making the difficult drive up the mountain, it meant the family had decided on some kind of intervention. "What do you want to do?" Ephraim asked, and Annie was grateful that he continued to treat her choices as her own to make. "Face whatever they've come to say, I suppose." Annie squared her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she was still learning she possessed. "But this time, I'm not letting anyone make me feel ashamed of the life I'm building here." Tom emerged from the sedan, looking incongruous in his business suit and polished shoes, clearly unprepared for the mountain terrain. He was accompanied by someone Annie didn't recognize, a young man in his 30s, with Ephraim's eyes, and the kind of rigid posture that spoke of long-held anger. "That's my son," Ephraim said quietly, and Annie heard something in his voice she'd never heard before, uncertainty mixed with pain. "Daniel. I haven't seen him in 3 years." The reunion Annie was about to witness, she realized, would be far more complicated than another family intervention. This was about wounds that ran deeper than her sister's disapproval or her mother's social anxieties. This was about a father and son who had been estranged by grief and misunderstanding, and somehow her presence on the mountain had prompted a confrontation that had been years in the making. As the two men approached the cabin, Annie could see the family resemblance in their bone structure and the way they carried themselves, but where Ephraim moved with the easy confidence of a man at peace with his choices, Daniel's gait was tight with suppressed anger and judgment. "Whatever happens," Annie said quietly, taking Ephraim's hand, "we face it together." Ephraim squeezed her fingers gratefully, but she could feel the tension in his body as he prepared to open his door to a son who had spent years believing the worst about his father's retreat from the world. Outside, Tom was speaking in low, urgent tones to Daniel, clearly trying to prepare him for whatever confrontation they had planned. Annie straightened her shoulders and prepared to defend not just her own choices, but the man who had become the most important person in her world. Whatever accusations Daniel had come to make, whatever ultimatums Tom might deliver on behalf of her family, she was no longer the broken woman who had stumbled through the snow in a torn wedding dress. She was someone who could heal injured animals, grow medicinal herbs, and choose her own path even when that path led through difficult conversations toward an uncertain future. The sound of footsteps on the porch announced the arrival of judgments and explanations that could no longer be avoided. Annie took a deep breath and prepared to fight for the life she was building, one honest conversation at a time. The knock on the door came with the authority of men who had driven a long way to deliver uncomfortable truths. Ephraim opened it to reveal his son Daniel, tall, lean, and radiating the kind of controlled anger that spoke of years of accumulated grievances. Behind him stood Tom, looking diplomatically uncomfortable in his role as family mediator. "Hello, Dad," Daniel said, the word carrying no warmth despite the genetic connection it acknowledged. His eyes swept the interior of the cabin, taking in Annie's presence with obvious disapproval. "I see you found yourself a new project." Annie felt Ephraim's body tense beside her, but his voice remained steady. "Daniel, it's been a long time." 3 years, 2 months, Daniel replied, with the precision of someone who had been counting. "Not that you bothered to keep track." Tom cleared his throat diplomatically. "Maybe we could all sit down and discuss this like civilized people. It's been a long drive, and I think everyone has things they need to say." Ephraim gestured toward the sitting area, but the civilized conversation Tom had hoped for began deteriorating immediately. Daniel remained standing, too agitated to settle, while his eyes took inventory of the cabin's changes, Annie's herb-drying racks by the windows, her mended clothes hanging near the fire, the small feminine touches that spoke of shared domestic space. "So this is what you've become," Daniel said, his voice cutting. "A man who takes advantage of vulnerable women half his age. I always wondered how low you'd sink after you abandoned your real family." "That's enough," Annie said before Ephraim could respond. "You don't know anything about your father or what kind of man he is." Daniel's laugh was bitter. "I know plenty about my father. I know that when my mother died, he couldn't handle being around his own son because I reminded him too much of what he'd lost. I know he sold our family home and disappeared into these mountains rather than deal with his grief like an adult. And I know that instead of being a grandfather to my children, he's playing house with a woman young enough to be his daughter." The accusations hung in the air like poison, and Annie could see how they landed on Ephraimic word, finding its mark in wounds that had never properly healed. But she also saw something Daniel couldn't or wouldn't see, the way his father's shoulders sagged, not with guilt, but with the exhaustion of carrying blame for choices made in desperate grief. "Your father saved my life," Annie said quietly. "When I had nowhere else to go and no one else who would help without expecting something in return, he opened his door and asked nothing but that I be honest about who I was. That's not taking advantage, that's being decent." "How convenient for you," Daniel shot back. "A rich old man with property and no family to leave it to. You must have thought you'd hit the lottery when you found him." The cruelty of the suggestion made Annie recoil as if she'd been slapped. But before she could respond, Ephraim stepped forward with an authority that reminded everyone in the room that this was his home and his choice about who belonged in it. "You will not speak to Annie that way in my house," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Whatever anger you have with me, she doesn't deserve to be caught in it. Doesn't she?" Daniel's composure was cracking, revealing the hurt child beneath the angry man. "She's living in the house that should have been my inheritance, playing wife to a man who couldn't be bothered to attend his own grandson's baptism. She's part of this now, Dad. Part of your pattern of replacing the people who actually love you with strangers who don't know enough to expect anything real from you." The raw pain in Daniel's voice cut through Annie's defensive anger, letting her see the situation from his perspective. Here was a man who had lost his mother at a crucial age, then watched his father retreat so completely into grief that Daniel had felt abandoned twice over. From his viewpoint, Annie's presence represented the final proof that Ephraim was capable of connection, just not with the family that needed him most. Tom, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional intensity of the confrontation, tried to steer the conversation toward practical matters. "Look, everyone's said some things that maybe went too far. But the reality is, Annie, your family is worried about you. Living up here, isolated from your support system, dependent on someone you've known for less than 2 months, it's not sustainable long term." "I'm not dependent," Annie said, though even as she spoke, she could hear how the words might sound hollow to outsiders. "I'm learning to be self-sufficient. By playing pioneer woman." Daniel's tone was mocking. "What happens when you get sick up here? When the roads are impassable and you need real medical help? What happens when the novelty wears off and you realize you've traded your real life for a romantic fantasy that can't survive contact with reality?" The question struck closer to home than Annie wanted to admit. She had been living day to day, reveling in her newfound sense of capability without seriously considering the long-term implications of her choice. What would happen when winter truly set in, when the isolation became oppressive rather than liberating, when the physical demands of mountain life outstripped her still developing skills? "I don't know," she admitted, "but not knowing doesn't mean I should go back to a life that was making me miserable just because it was safer." Ephraim had been listening to the exchange with growing tension, and now he moved to the window, staring out at the mountains that had been his refuge for 15 years. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of decisions that had been building for weeks. "Maybe Daniel's right," he said, not turning around. "Maybe I am too old for this, too set in my ways, too damaged by my own losses to be fair to someone just starting to figure out who she wants to be." Annie felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Ephraim, don't. You deserve better than a man who's spent 15 years running away from life," he continued, finally turning to face her. "You deserve someone who can give you a real future, not just a hiding place from your past." The words hit Annie like physical blows, but she could see the fear behind them, fear that Daniel's accusations held enough truth to poison what they'd been building together. Ephraim was retreating into the protective shell of solitude that had served him for so long, choosing familiar loneliness over the risk of being hurt again. "That's not your choice to make," Annie said, her voice strengthening with each word. "You don't get to decide what I deserve or what kind of future I want. I've had enough of men making those decisions for me." She turned to face Daniel and Tom, drawing on every ounce of confidence she'd gained in her months on the mountain. "And you don't get to come into this house and tear down something good just because it doesn't fit your idea of what my life should look like." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the soft whistle of wind through the pine trees outside. Annie could feel the weight of their judgment, but also the strength she'd found in herself over the past months, strength that had been built through honest work, honest choices, and the honest affection of a man who had never asked her to be anything other than herself. "I'm not playing house or living a fantasy," she said quietly. "I'm building a life with someone who sees me as I actually am, not as what he needs me to be. If you can't understand that or respect it, then you need to leave." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head with bitter resignation. "You're making a mistake that's going to cost you everything. And when it falls apart, when he gets tired of pretending to be someone he's not, or when you realize that love isn't enough to survive, winters that can kill you, don't expect the people who actually care about you to be waiting to pick up the pieces." He headed for the door, pausing only to look back at his father. "I came here thinking maybe it was time to try again, to see if you'd changed, if you were ready to be part of your real family. But you're still the same man who chose solitude over responsibility, running away over fighting for what matters. I won't make this mistake again." The door closed behind him with finality that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Tom lingered for a moment, looking genuinely sorry for the pain the conversation had caused. "Annie, if you change your mind, if you need help or just want to come home, you know where to find us," he said gently. "Your family loves you, even when they don't understand your choices." After he left, the cabin felt hollow despite the warmth of the fire and the familiar comfort of shared space. Annie and Ephraim stood in the aftermath of accusations and ultimatums, both struggling with doubts that had been planted by people who claimed to love them. "He's not entirely wrong," Ephraim said finally, "about me running away, about the risks you're taking by staying here." Annie moved to him, taking his weathered hands in her smaller ones. "Maybe not entirely, but he's wrong about what matters most. He's wrong about us." Outside, the sound of car engines faded down the mountain road, carrying away another set of voices that insisted they knew better than Annie what her life should look like. But this time, instead of feeling isolated by their departure, Annie felt something else: determination to prove that love could indeed be enough, if both people were brave enough to choose it over the safety of convention and the comfort of others' approval. Winter was coming to the high country, and with it would come the real test of everything she and Ephraim had been building together. But for the first time in her life, Annie felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, sustained by the knowledge that she was finally, truly, choosing her own path. The first real blizzard of winter arrived 3 weeks after Daniel's visit, bringing with it the kind of isolation that tested both practical skills and emotional resilience. Annie woke to find the world-transformed snow piled 3 feet deep against the cabin windows, wind howling through the pines with a ferocity that made the sturdy log walls creak and groan. "Looks like we're snowed in for a few days," Ephraim said matter-of-factly as he built up the fire and started coffee. "Good thing we stocked up on supplies last week." Annie had grown accustomed to the rhythm of mountain winters, but this storm felt different, more serious, more isolating than anything she'd experienced. When she tried to open the front door to check the depth of the snow, the wind nearly knocked her backward into the cabin. "That's a good way to get frostbite," Ephraim said, pulling her back inside and wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Storm like this, you don't go outside unless it's a genuine emergency." They settled into the enforced confinement with the easy companionship that had developed over months of shared space and daily routines. Annie worked on a quilt she'd been piecing together from scraps of Martha's old dressessa project Ephraim had suggested when she'd found the fabric stored in a cedar chest and asked if she could use it for something practical. She'd liked knowing her dresses were being turned into something useful, he'd said. Martha always hated waste, especially when it came to beautiful things. Now, as the storm raged outside, Annie found comfort in the repetitive work of stitching small pieces into larger patterns. Ephraim sat nearby, updating his meticulous weather records, a habit he'd maintained for 15 years, tracking temperature, precipitation, wind patterns, and seasonal changes with the dedication of a true naturalist. It was while reaching for a pencil that had rolled under the desk that Annie's hand encountered something unexpected: a metal strongbox pushed far back under the desk's modesty panel. She pulled it out curiously, noting its substantial weight and the brass nameplate that read, "First National Bank of Denver." "Ephraim," she called, holding up the box. "What's this?" The effect of her discovery was immediate and dramatic. Ephraim went completely still, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, and something flickered across his face that looked almost like guilt. "That's nothing important," he said, but his voice carried a tension Annie had never heard before. "Just old papers and such. You can put it back." But Annie's curiosity was aroused, partly by the box itself, and partly by Ephraim's obvious discomfort. The strongbox was clearly expensive, the kind of thing used to store documents of real value. And the way Ephraim was avoiding her eyes suggested there was more to its contents than old papers. "It's pretty heavy for just papers," she said, setting it on the table between them. "And why keep it hidden under the desk?" "Annie, please." Ephraim's voice held a warning note. "Some things are private. Leave it be." But something in his tone, the careful neutrality that had replaced his usual warmth, made Annie's instincts sharpen. In all their months together, Ephraim had never been secretive about anything. He'd shown her his journals, his photographs of Martha, even his letters from Daniel during their brief periods of communication. The idea that he was hiding something significant felt like a betrayal of the honesty they'd built their relationship on. "What's in here that you don't want me to see?" she asked, her hand resting on the box's lid. The silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid. Ephraim set down his coffee and rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. "It's not what you think," he said finally. "I don't know what to think, because you won't tell me what it is." Annie's voice was rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "After everything we've shared, everything we've been through together, you're going to sit there and tell me I can't know what's in this box?" Ephraim was quiet for so long that Annie began to wonder if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. "Open it if you have to. But Annie, what you find in there, it doesn't change who I am. It doesn't change what we've built here." The lock on the strongbox was a simple combination type, and to Annie's surprise, it opened when she tried Martha's birthday, a date she'd learned from Ephraim's stories. Inside, she found a collection of documents that made her breath catch in her throat. Land deeds, dozens of them, covering thousands of acres throughout the Colorado Rockies. Stock certificates from mining companies, timber operations, and real estate development firms. Bank statements showing accounts with balances that made Annie's eyes widen in disbelief. And at the bottom of the pile, a will that named Ephraim as the sole heir to what appeared to be a substantial fortune. "My God," Annie whispered, picking up a deed that showed Ephraim owned not just the 300 acres around his cabin, but nearly 10,000 acres of prime mountain real estate. "You're rich. You're actually wealthy." "My grandfather was a prospector who got lucky," Ephraim said quietly. "Found silver in the mountains, back when there was still silver to be found. My father turned that luck into a business empire. When he died, it all came to me." Annie stared at the documents in her hands, trying to reconcile the man she'd come to know, who split his own firewood, mended his own clothes, and lived with the frugal simplicity of someone who counted every dollar with the evidence of enormous wealth spread across his kitchen table. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, though even as she spoke, she began to understand the implications of what she'd discovered. "Because I've been burned before," Ephraim said, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to come from deep experience. "After Martha died, word got around about the inheritance. Suddenly I had more friends than I'd ever had in my life. Women who found me charming despite never having noticed me before. People with business opportunities and investment schemes, and sob stories about how a small loan would change their lives. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Annie remembered her first night in the cabin, how quickly Ephraim had offered her shelter and support. She thought about the ease with which he'd accepted her presence, the way he'd never seemed worried about the practical costs of feeding an additional person through the winter. "You thought I was after your money," she said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "No," Ephraim said quickly, then amended. "Not at first. You were genuinely in trouble, genuinely hurt. But as time went on, as we got closer," he gestured helplessly, "I needed to know that what you felt was real, that you were here for me, not for what I could give you." Annie felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Everything she'd believed about their relationship, about Ephraim's motivations and her own, was suddenly cast in a different light. Had he been testing her all along, watching to see if she would start asking for expensive gifts or making hints about her financial future? "So you lied to me," she said, her voice hollow with betrayal. "For months, you let me believe you were just a simple mountain man living off savings and pension checks. You let me worry about being a burden, about eating your food and using your supplies. You watched me patch my clothes and make do with cast-offs while you sat on a fortune." "I didn't lie," Ephraim said desperately. "I just didn't tell you everything. There's a difference." "Is there?" Annie stood abruptly, the bank statement scattering to the floor. "Because it feels exactly like lying to me. It feels like you've been playing some kind of game, testing whether I'd pass your secret examination." The hurt in her voice seemed to hit Ephraim like a physical blow. He reached toward her, but Annie stepped back, putting the width of the table between them. "Annie, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" "That you've been treating our entire relationship like some kind of experiment. That while I was falling in love with you, you were calculating whether I was trustworthy enough to deserve the truth." The word love hung between them like a bridge that had been built too late. Annie had said it without meaning to, in anger and hurt rather than tenderness, and now it lay broken in the space between her accusations and his silence. "You think I don't love you?" Ephraim's voice was rough with emotion. "You think this has all been some kind of test, instead of the best months I've had since Martha died?" "I don't know what to think anymore," Annie said, tears starting to blur her vision. "I thought I knew who you were. I thought we were partners, equals, building something together. But all this time, you've been holding back the most fundamental truth about your life. How can I trust anything else you've told me?" She was already moving toward the stairs, driven by a need to escape the suffocating weight of betrayal and confusion. Behind her, she could hear Ephraim calling her name, but the sound felt distant and hollow, like an echo from a dream she was finally waking up from. In the small upstairs room that had become her sanctuary, Annie threw her few possessions into the bag she'd arrived with months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on Hirsch was preparing to leave the same way she'd arrived, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of broken dreams. But as she packed, anger began to replace hurt. She'd spent her entire adult life being deceived by men who thought they knew what was best for her, who made unilateral decisions about what she should and shouldn't know about her own life. First, her husbands, who'd hidden their growing resentment and dissatisfaction until it exploded into abandonment. Then Marcus, who'd pretended to accept her past while secretly judging her for it. And now Ephraim, who'd claimed to value honesty while maintaining the most significant deception of all. The storm outside seemed to be intensifying, and Annie realized with bitter irony that she was trapped here for at least another day or two. She would have to sit across the table from a man who had fundamentally deceived her, pretend everything was normal, while she figured out how to rebuild her life from the ruins of another failed relationship. When she finally came downstairs, she found Ephraim sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with the expression of a man who had lost something precious through his own poor choices. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "about what happens when this storm clears." Ephraim looked up hopefully, but Annie's expression killed whatever optimism he might have been harboring. "I'll need you to drive me to town. I'll figure out what comes next from there." The finality in her voice seemed to hit him like a physical blow. "Annie, we need to talk about this. We need to work through." "Work through what? The fact that you've been lying to me for months? The fact that while I was sharing every truth about my past, you were calculating whether I was worthy of yours?" She moved to the kitchen and began preparing dinner with mechanical precision, needing something to do with her hands while her world fell apart around her. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, trapping them together in a space that had once felt like home and now felt like a prison built from broken trust and shattered dreams. The blizzard that had begun as nature's reminder of winter's power had become something far more destructive, the weather system that revealed the fundamental instability in the foundation of everything Annie had believed about her new life. As snow continued to pile against the windows and wind howled through the darkness, she began the painful process of accepting that once again, She had built her hopes on a man who had been keeping secrets about who he really was. The storm lasted 3 days, 3 of the longest days of Annie's life. She and Ephraim moved around each other in the cabin like polite strangers, sharing meals in uncomfortable silence and sleeping in separate rooms for the first time since she'd arrived. The easy intimacy they'd built over months dissolved into a careful dance of avoidance and unspoken recriminations. On the morning the storm finally broke, Annie woke to brilliant sunshine streaming through ice-covered windows and the sound of Ephraim's truck engine turning over in the clearing outside. She dressed quickly in her warmest clothes and came downstairs to find him waiting by the door, truck keys in his weathered hand. "Roads should be passable now," he said without meeting her eyes, "if you're still determined to leave." The careful neutrality in his voice hit Annie harder than anger would have. This was the tone of a man who had already accepted defeat, who was going through the motions of cooperation while grieving something that had died before its time. "I'm still determined," she said, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. The drive down the mountain was conducted in silence, broken only by the crunch of snow under the truck's tires and the occasional scrape of tree branches against the windows. Annie stared out at the winter landscape that had become so familiar, the stands of aspen bare against the snow, the distant peaks sharp and clean in the brilliant morning light, the frozen creek that had taught her to recognize the approach of storms by the sound of ice forming in its shallows. She was leaving behind not just a man she'd loved, but a version of herself she'd only just discovered. The woman who could split firewood and tend injured animals, who could read weather signs and grow healing herbs, who had found strength in honest work and simple living. That woman belonged to these mountains in a way that the old Annie, one who'd spent years trying to fit into other people's ideas of who she should behave, never belonged anywhere. When they reached the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Ephraim pulled over at the entrance to the town cemetery. It was an odd choice, and Annie looked at him questioningly. "I need to show you something," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Before you go back to your old life and decide what you think of me, there's something you need to understand." He led her through the snow-covered cemetery to a simple granite headstone marked Martha Elizabeth Lott, beloved wife and mother. Below it, a smaller stone read James Daniel Lott, our angel son. Fresh flowers lay against the stones, despite the recent blizzard. Someone had been here recently, someone who still mourned these long-ago losses. "I come here every month," Ephraim said quietly. "Have for 20 years. Used to come more often, but monthly visits seemed about right, for staying connected without living in the past." Annie stared at the graves, trying to understand why he'd brought her here now, in the middle of their painful separation. "When Martha died," Ephraim continued, "people started treating me differently. Not just the fortune hunters I told you about, though there were plenty of those. Even people who'd known me for years suddenly saw me as the wealthy widower, instead of just Ephraim. Everything I did was filtered through what they knew about my bank account. If I was generous, it was because I could afford to be. If I was private, it was because I was hiding something. I couldn't just be a man grieving his wife and son. I had to be a rich man grieving, and that changed everything." He knelt and brushed snow off Martha's headstone with gentle care. "I moved to the mountain because I needed to find out who I was when money wasn't part of the equation. When people couldn't see my net worth before they saw me, I built that cabin with my own hands, lived off the basics, made friends with folks who knew me as just another mountain hermit. For 15 years, I was just Ephraim Lott, Ephraim the heir, not Ephraim the catch, just a man trying to figure out how to live with loss." Annie felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she began to understand what he was trying to tell her. "When you showed up that night, you didn't see a wealthy man who could solve your problems," he said, standing to face her. "You saw someone who offered you coffee and a warm place to sit. You fell in love with a man who split firewood and played chess and taught you to read the weather, not a man who could buy you anything you wanted or secure your financial future. But you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth," Annie said, though her anger was beginning to give way to something more complicated. "I was scared," Ephraim admitted. Scared that once you knew about the money, it would change how you saw me. Scared that you'd start to wonder if your feelings were real or if you were unconsciously influenced by security I could provide. Scared that I'd lose the first genuine connection I'd had with another person in 20 years. The admission hung between them in the cold morning air. Annie could see her breath misting as she tried to process what he'd told her, tried to separate her legitimate hurt from her understanding of the fear that had motivated his deception. "So what now?" she asked. "I'm supposed to just forgive the lie and pretend it doesn't matter that you didn't trust me?" "I don't know," Ephraim said honestly. "I know I was wrong to keep it from you. I know I hurt you by treating our relationship like something that needed to be tested instead of something that deserved to be trusted. But Annie," he stepped closer, his grey eyes intense with emotion, "I also know that what we had was real. The woman who learned to split wood and tend injured animals, who made me laugh and made me hope again, that woman fell in love with a man who deserved her trust. I just wish I'd been brave enough to trust her back." They stood in silence among the snow-covered graves, two people who had found unexpected love and then watched it crumble under the weight of fear and misunderstanding. Around them, the town of Cedar Falls was waking up to another winter day, people beginning their routines without knowing that Annie Holt was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of her life. "I need time to think," Annie said finally. "Time to figure out who I am when I'm not reacting to being deceived or trying to prove something to people who've already made up their minds about me." Ephraim nodded, though she could see the hope dying in his eyes. "Where will you go?" "I don't know. Maybe I'll stay with Carol for a while, or get my own place in town. Maybe I'll travel, see some of the world before I decide what comes next." She looked back toward the mountains, visible in the distance above the town's rooflines. "I just know I can't go back to being the woman I was before I met you. She doesn't fit me anymore." "That woman was never who you really were," Ephraim said softly. "She was just who you thought you had to be to make other people happy." They walked back to the truck in silence, both aware that they were approaching a goodbye that might be permanent. When Ephraim pulled up in front of Carol's house, a neat Victorian with a white picket fence and carefully maintained flower beds buried under snow, Annie felt like she was approaching the border between two different countries. "Annie," Ephraim said as she reached for the door handle, "whatever you decide about us, don't let anyone convince you to go back to being smaller than you really are. You're stronger and more capable than you ever gave yourself credit for. Don't forget that, just because some people can't see it." She turned to look at him one last time, memorizing the weathered features that had become so dear to her, the grey eyes that had seen her more clearly than anyone ever had, the hands that had taught her to work with tools and tend growing things. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt inadequate for everything he'd given her, not just shelter and kindness, but a glimpse of who she could be when she stopped trying to fit into spaces too small for her actual size. She was halfway up Carol's front walk when she heard his truck driving away, taking with it the last connection to the life she'd built on the mountain. Behind her lay months of genuine happiness and growth. Ahead lay the unknown territory of rebuilding herself from the pieces of who she'd been and who she'd discovered she could become. The front door opened before she could knock, revealing Carol's shocked face and the warm interior of a house that smelled like coffee and bacon and the kind of conventional domesticity Annie had spent years trying and failing to master. "Annie? Oh my God, what are you doing here? What happened?" But Annie couldn't answer immediately. She was too busy trying to figure out how to explain that she'd discovered love and lost it, found herself and lost that too, and now needed to figure out how to rebuild everything from scratch again. Inside the house, she could hear the sounds of Carol's family beginning their day. Tom's voice on a work call, the children arguing over breakfast, the television announcing the morning news. It was exactly the kind of life she'd always thought she wanted, the kind of stable, predictable existence that seemed to elude her despite her best efforts. But standing on the threshold between her old world and whatever came next, Annie realized she no longer envied Carol's conventional happiness. She wanted something different, now something messier and more authentic, something that honored the person she'd discovered herself to be during those months on the mountain. The question was whether she could build that life without the man who'd helped her discover it in the first place. Living with Carol was like putting on clothes that had shrunk in the wash. Very thing that had once been familiar now felt constrictive and uncomfortable. Annie spent 2 weeks sleeping in her niece's pink bedroom, surrounded by boy band posters and stuffed animals, trying to remember how to fit into a world of scheduled meals, television programs, and conversations about grocery store sales and neighborhood gossip. "You seem different," Carol observed one morning over coffee, studying Annie's face with the critical attention of someone looking for signs of damage. "Older somehow?" "More." She struggled for the word. "Serious, I guess." Annie looked down at her hands, noting how the calluses from splitting wood had begun to soften, how her nails were growing longer again now that she wasn't using them for practical work. "Maybe I am more serious. Maybe I needed to be." "Well, you can relax now," Carol said briskly. "You're back in civilization, back with people who care about you. Whatever spell that mountain man cast on you, it's broken now." But that was exactly the problem. Annie didn't feel like the spell was broken. She felt like she'd been woken up from a dream of authentic living and forced back into a performance she no longer knew how to give. She missed the rhythm of physical work, the satisfaction of tasks that had tangible results, the quiet companionship of evenings spent reading by firelight instead of staring at television screens. Most of all, she missed Ephraim. Not just his presence, but the version of herself that had emerged in response to his steady, accepting love. With him, she'd been capable, confident, genuinely useful. Here, she was just Carol's troubled little sister again, the woman who couldn't make marriage work and needed to be rescued from her own poor judgment. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, during a family dinner where Annie sat quietly while Tom explained his latest business deal and Carol discussed the politics of the school board election. Their teenage daughter Madison was describing her plans for college when she casually mentioned wanting to study veterinary medicine. "That's wonderful," Annie said, speaking up for the first time all evening. "You know, I've been working with injured animals recently. There's something incredibly satisfying about helping creatures that can't help themselves." Madison's eyes lit up with interest. "Really? What kind of animals? Where did you learn how to do that?" "Up on the mountain. I started with birds, mostly hawks and owls, that had been injured in storms or fights. Then I worked with some of the neighbors' livestock when they had problems they couldn't afford to take to the vet in town." As Annie described her experiences, she felt something awakening in her chest, pride in what she'd accomplished, excitement about skills she'd developed, passion for work that had felt genuinely meaningful. She was so absorbed in the conversation that she didn't notice the worried looks passing between Carol and Tom until Madison asked the question that changed everything. "Could you teach me? I mean, when I come home for Christmas break, could you show me some of what you learned?" The simple request hit Annie like lightning. Here was someone who saw value in what she'd learned, who recognized that her months on the mountain hadn't been a waste of time, but an education in something genuinely important. For the first time since leaving Ephraim's cabin, Annie felt like herself, again not the diminished version Carol saw, but the capable woman she'd discovered she could be. "I'd love to teach you," she said, then paused as the implications of her answer sank in. "But I'd need to be somewhere I could practice those skills myself." The conversation that followed was difficult and painful, with Carol alternating between anger and tears, as Annie explained that she couldn't simply return to her old life and pretend the past months hadn't happened. "You're throwing your life away for a man who lied to you," Carol said desperately. "A man who's probably already forgotten you exist while you're pining away like some lovesick teenager." "This isn't about Ephraim," Annie said, though even as she spoke, she knew that wasn't entirely true. "This is about me figuring out who I want to be and where I belong." But Carol's words haunted her through the sleepless night that followed. What if Ephraim had already moved on? What if her leaving had simply confirmed his belief that relationships were too complicated, too risky to be worth the effort? What if she was building her plans around a connection that had already been severed beyond repair? The next morning, driven by a need to know the truth, Annie borrowed Carol's car and drove up to the mountain. She told herself she was just going to collect some belongings she'd left behind, maybe check on the herb garden she'd planted behind the cabin. She wasn't going to beg for forgiveness or try to resurrect something that had died under the weight of broken trust. But when she reached the clearing where Ephraim's cabin sat among the pine trees, what she saw made her heart stop. A moving truck was parked beside the house, and men were carrying furniture and boxes down from the porch. Through the open door, she could see the interior being systematically emptied, the hand-carved chess set, the books she'd helped him organize, even Martha's quilt that had comforted Annie through her first night as a refugee from her own wedding. Ephraim emerged from the cabin carrying a wooden crate, and when he saw Annie's car, he stopped so abruptly that one of the movers had to swerve to avoid running into him. Even from a distance, Annie could see the shock on his weathered face, followed quickly by something that looked like pain. She got out of the car on unsteady legs, her mind reeling as she tried to process what she was witnessing. "What's happening here?" "I'm moving," Ephraim said, setting down the crate with unnecessary care. Heading back to town, figured it was time to rejoin civilization. The words hit Annie like physical blows. In all her imagined scenarios about returning to the mountain, she'd never considered that Ephraim might not be here. The cabin had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, as much a part of him as his weathered hands or silver beard. "Why?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Ephraim's grey eyes met hers across the snowy clearing, and she saw 20 years of accumulated solitude in their depths. "Turns out living alone isn't as easy as it used to be. Not after," he gestured helplessly, "not after knowing what it was like to share this place with someone who understood what made it special." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Around them, the movers continued their efficient dismantling of the life Ephraim had built in these mountains, packing away 15 years of deliberate solitude piece by careful piece. "Where will you go?" Annie asked. "Bought a house in town. Nothing fancy, just a place with running water and neighbors close enough to hear if I have a heart attack." His attempt at humor fell flat, weighted down by the genuine sadness in his voice. "Figured I might as well be lonely somewhere with better medical facilities." Annie stared at him, trying to reconcile this defeated man with the confident mountain dweller who had taught her to split wood and read weather signs. "You're giving up everything you built here because I couldn't handle finding out you had money." "I'm giving up everything I built here because without you, it's just a cabin full of memories and regrets." Ephraim's voice was rough with emotion. "I can remember Martha anywhere, Annie, but I can only remember us here, and that's become more painful than comforting." The honesty of his words cut through Annie's defenses like a blade. She'd been so focused on her own hurt, her own sense of betrayal, that she hadn't fully considered the cost of her leaving to the man who had opened his heart for the first time in 20 years. "Ephraim," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't say anything kind or forgiving. I made my choice when I decided not to trust you with the truth. I have to live with the consequences." One of the movers approached, consulting his clipboard. "Mr. Lott, we're ready for the bedroom furniture. You want us to pack up that stuff on the mantel too?" Annie's eyes went immediately to the fireplace, where her wedding ring still sat among Ephraim's collection of interesting stones and weathered wood. The small diamond caught the winter light streaming through the windows, a tiny beacon of abandoned promises and discarded futures. "Pack it all," Ephraim said without looking at the ring. "Nothing stays behind." But Annie was already moving toward the mantel, drawn by the sight of that small symbol of everything she'd tried to leave behind when she'd chosen to stay on the mountain. She picked up the ring and stared at it, remembering the woman who had placed it there, broken, desperate, convinced that love was something that happened to other people. Now she understood that the ring represented more than just her failed engagement to Marcus. It represented every time she'd tried to fit herself into someone else's idea of who she should be, every compromise she'd made to earn love that was conditional on her being less than she really was. "I don't want this anymore," she said, closing her fist around the ring. "I don't want what it represents." She walked to the window and opened it, letting the cold mountain air rush into the cabin one last time. Then, without ceremony, she threw the ring as far as she could into the snow-covered clearing. It disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the white expanse like a secret the mountain would keep forever. When she turned back to face Ephraim, she saw something new in his eyes: surprise, hope, and a question he was afraid to ask out loud. "I'm not here to get you back," she said quickly, before either of them could misinterpret her gesture. "I'm here because I realized something important while I was sitting in my sister's pink bedroom, trying to remember how to be the person I used to be." Ephraim waited, his weathered hands still on the box he'd been preparing to load into the truck. "I can't go back to who I was before I met you," Annie continued. "That woman doesn't exist anymore. But I also can't move forward until I forgive you for not trusting me and forgive myself for running away instead of fighting for what we had." The words hung in the air between them while the movers continued their work around them, dismantling the life they'd built together, one piece at a time. The silence that followed Annie's words was broken only by the sounds of the movers loading Ephraim's life into cardboard boxes and the distant call of a hawk circling above the clearing. Ephraim stared at her with an expression that cycled through disbelief, hope, and caution so quickly that Annie could barely track the changes. "What are you saying?" he asked quietly. Annie took a deep breath, drawing strength from the mountain air that had become as essential to her as breathing. "I'm saying that I spent 2 weeks trying to fit back into my old life, and it felt like wearing clothes that belonged to someone else. I'm saying that the woman who learned to split wood and tend injured animals and grow healing herbs, that woman is who I really am, and she doesn't exist without this place." She gestured around the cabin, taking in the stone fireplace where they'd spent countless evenings, the kitchen table where they'd shared meals and conversations that had shaped her understanding of herself, the windows that looked out on mountains that had taught her about endurance and beauty, and the kind of strength that came from choosing to stay rather than run. "But more than that," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "she doesn't exist without you. Not because I need you to take care of me or solve my problems, but because you're the person who saw who I could become and gave me space to grow into that person." Ephraim set down the box he'd been holding and took a step toward her. "Annie, I made a terrible mistake. I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning. I should have—" "You should have," Annie agreed, cutting him off. "But I should have fought for us instead of running away the moment things got complicated. I should have remembered that everyone makes mistakes, even good men who are scared of being hurt again." The admission cost her something: pride, perhaps, or the comfortable narrative that cast her as the victim of his deception. But it also freed her from the weight of righteous anger that had been poisoning her happiness for weeks. "I've been thinking about what you said at the cemetery," she continued, "about being scared that money would change how I saw you. And you know what? You were right to be scared. Not because I'm a gold digger, but because money does change things. It creates different possibilities, different responsibilities, different ways of being in the world." Ephraim's face fell, and Annie realized he was misinterpreting her words. "But that's not necessarily bad," she said quickly. "It just means we need to figure out together what those changes look like, what it means to build a life that honors both who we are and what we have to work with." One of the movers approached with another question about packing, but Ephraim waved him away with an impatience that suggested his attention was completely focused on the conversation he and Annie were having. "What are you proposing?" he asked. Annie looked around the cabin one more time, memorizing the details she'd come to associate with home, the way afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, the arrangement of books on the shelves Ephraim had built with his own hands, the herbs still drying in bundles near the stove from her last harvest before the blizzard. "Don't sell this place," she said. "Don't pack it up and abandon it because we made mistakes that we can learn from. Annie, let me finish." She moved closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, close enough to smell the familiar scent of wood smoke and pine that clung to his clothes. "I'm not asking you to pretend the money doesn't exist. I'm asking you to let me be part of figuring out what to do with it. Let me help you find ways to use wealth that honor the values you've learned living up here." The idea had been forming in her mind during the sleepless nights in Carol's guest room, crystallizing into something that felt like purpose rather than mere possibility. "There are other people like me," she continued, "people who need a place to figure out who they are when they're not performing for other people's expectations. What if this could be that place? What if we could create something here that helps people discover their own strength?" Ephraim was staring at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "You want to turn the mountain into some kind of retreat. I want to turn it into a place where people can learn to trust themselves, where they can develop skills that make them feel capable and useful, where they can discover that they're stronger than they think they are." Annie's voice was gaining momentum as the vision became clearer in her mind. "We could offer workshops on practical skills, woodworking, gardening, animal care. We could have spaces for quiet reflection, for healing, for people to figure out what comes next in their lives." She paused, suddenly aware that she was presuming a great deal about Ephraim's willingness to reshape his life around her ideas. "If you want to, that is," she added more quietly, "if you think it's something we could build together." Ephraim was quiet for so long that Annie began to worry she'd overstepped, proposed something too ambitious or too presumptuous for a relationship they were still trying to rebuild. But when he finally spoke, his voice was warm with something that sounded like wonder. "You want to help other people find what you found up here." "I want to help other people find what we found up here," Annie corrected. "Because it wasn't just the mountains that changed me, Ephraim. It was you. It was the way you saw me as someone worth teaching, worth trusting, worth loving, exactly as I was." The words hung between them like a bridge finally ready to be crossed. Around them, the movers had stopped their work, sensing that something important was happening that shouldn't be interrupted. "I love you," Ephraim said simply. "I've loved you since that first night when you sat by my fire and told me your story without trying to make it prettier than it was. I love your courage and your stubbornness and the way you throw yourself into learning new things like your life depends on it." "I love you too," Annie replied, the words coming easily now that she'd stopped fighting them. "I love the way you see the best in people and give them room to grow into it. I love that you've spent 15 years learning to live deliberately, with intention, making choices based on what matters rather than what's expected." They moved toward each other as if drawn by gravity, meeting in the middle of the cabin that had sheltered their love through its beginning, its testing, and now, perhaps, its true beginning. When Ephraim kissed her, Annie tasted forgiveness and promise, the salt of tears and the sweetness of hope. She felt his weathered hands frame her face with the same gentleness he'd shown that first night when she'd been a stranger in need of shelter. "So what happens now?" he asked, when they finally broke apart. Annie looked around the cabin, at the movers standing awkwardly with their half-packed boxes, at the evidence of a life being dismantled that might now have a reason to be rebuilt. "Now we tell these nice men they can go home," she said with a smile that felt like sunrise after the longest night, "and then we start planning what comes next." Ephraim's answering smile transformed his weathered face, making him look years younger and infinitely happier. "Mr. Lott," one of the movers called hesitantly, "what do you want us to do with the rest of this stuff?" Ephraim looked at Annie, who nodded encouragingly. "Put it all back," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had just remembered what he was fighting for. "Everything goes back exactly where it was. We're staying." As the movers began the process of unpacking a life that had almost been abandoned, Annie walked to the mantel where her wedding ring had sat for so many months. The space where it had been was empty now, but somehow that emptiness felt full of possibility rather than loss. She picked up the hand-carved chess set from a nearby box and began setting up the pieces on the table by the window. When Ephraim joined her, she smiled up at him with the kind of happiness that comes from choosing love over fear, growth over safety, and the unknown future over the comfortable patterns of the past. "Your move," she said, and he laughed a sound of pure joy that echoed off the cabin walls and promised years of shared decisions, shared challenges. and shared dreams built on the solid foundation of hard-won trust and freely given love. 2 years later, Annie stood in the herb garden behind the cabin, her hands deep in rich soil as she transplanted seedlings that would become medicine for both body and spirit. The garden had expanded far beyond her original modest plot, now encompassing nearly an acre of carefully tended beds where chamomile grew beside echinacea, lavender intertwined with yarrow, and dozens of other healing plants flourished in the mountain air. The Henderson Workshop Group is asking if you'll teach them about tincture making next month, Ephraim called from the cabin's back porch, where he was putting finishing touches on a rocking chair that would soon join the dozen others scattered around the property. Tell them yes, Annie replied, brushing soil from her hands as she admired the neat rows of green growth. But they'll need to help with the harvest first. No shortcuts to understanding where medicine comes from. The Mountain Heart Healing Center had grown organically from their shared vision, becoming something neither of them had imagined when they'd first talked about helping others find their strength. What had started as weekend workshops for a handful of neighbors had evolved into month-long retreats that drew people from across the country, individuals seeking to reconnect with their capabilities, couples rebuilding relationships after crisis, even corporate groups learning about authentic leadership through practical skills. Annie had discovered she was a natural teacher, able to break down complex tasks into manageable steps while never losing sight of the deeper lessons each skill contained. Whether she was showing someone how to set a bird's broken wing or explaining the patience required to coax medicinal properties from stubborn roots, she helped people understand that competence was built one small success at a time. Ephraim had proven equally gifted at creating spaces where people felt safe to be vulnerable, to admit they didn't know how to do things they thought they should know, to start over at ages when society suggested they should have everything figured out. His weathered hands had built not just workshop spaces and guest cabins, but environments where people could shed their defensive personas and discover who they really were underneath. The sound of voices carried across the clearing as the current retreat group gathered for their evening reflection session. Annie could see them through the trees, a recently divorced teacher learning to trust her own judgment again, a retired executive discovering that his hands could create beautiful things when they weren't focused on profit margins, a young mother finding her voice after years of defining herself solely through her children's needs. "They're good people," Ephraim said, joining Annie in the garden as they watched their guests settle into the circle of chairs he'd arranged near the fire pit. "Remind me of someone I used to know, someone who stumbled up here in a wedding dress and a whole lot of pain, convinced she was too broken to be worth fixing." Annie leaned into his solid warmth, still amazed after 2 years that she got to keep this, the daily miracle of being seen, understood, and loved exactly as she was. That woman wasn't broken. She was just trying to fit into the wrong-sized life. Took her a while to figure that out. Took her longer to figure out that the right-sized life was worth fighting for, even when it got complicated. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the peaks that had witnessed their individual journeys toward healing and their shared journey toward love. The mountains looked exactly the same as they had the night Annie first stumbled into this clearing, but everything else had transformed beyond recognition. The cabin itself had grown to accommodate their expanded life. A new wing held Annie's consultation room, where she worked with people and animals who needed healing, while Ephraim's workshop buzzed with the sounds of people learning to create useful beauty with their own hands. The guest cabins scattered through the trees provided privacy for retreat participants while maintaining the sense of community that made the healing possible. But the most significant changes were invisible to casual observers. They lived in the way Annie moved through her days with quiet confidence, in the way Ephraim's laughter came easier and more frequently, in the way they navigated disagreements with the hard-won knowledge that love could survive conflict, if both people were willing to choose it over being right. "Annie?" Ephraim's voice carried a note of nervous excitement that made her look up at him curiously. "There's something I want to show you." He led her to the workshop, where a covered object sat on his main workbench. When he pulled away the cloth, Annie gasped. It was a weather vane, exquisitely carved from mountain ash, depicting a woman with her hair flowing in an invisible wind, her face turned toward the sky with an expression of joyous determination. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "But why?" "For the main cabin," Ephraim said, his weathered cheeks flushing slightly. "Thought it was time this place had a proper weather vane. One that shows which way the wind's blowing and reminds everyone who sees it that sometimes the most important direction is the one that leads you home." Annie stared at the carved figure, recognizing not just her own features but something deeper, the essence of who she'd become in this place, with this man. Strong but not hardened, independent but not isolated, beautiful in the way that came from living authentically rather than performing for approval. "When you install it," she said, standing on her toes to kiss him, "I want to help. I want to be part of putting it up there where everyone can see it. It's going to be heavy work, getting it mounted properly. Good thing I know how to do heavy work now." As if summoned by their voices, Daniel appeared in the workshop doorway. No longer the angry man who had confronted them 2 years earlier, but someone who had learned to separate his grief about the past from his hopes for the future. His monthly visits had become a treasured part of their routine, and his children had claimed Annie as the honorary aunt who taught them to identify animal tracks and grow their own vegetables. "Dad asked me to bring this up from town," Daniel said, holding up a small velvet box that made Annie's heart skip. "Said you'd know what it was for." Ephraim took the box, with hands that trembled slightly, then dropped to one knee in the sawdust of his workshop, surrounded by the tools he used to create beautiful things and the evidence of the life he and Annie had built together. "Annie Holt," he said, opening the box to reveal not a diamond ring but a simple band carved from the same mountain ash as the weather vane, inlaid with tiny stones from their clearing. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need taking care of, and not because I need someone to make my life complete, but because what we've built together is worth making official. Because I want the whole world to know that you're the woman who taught me it's never too late to start over, never too late to choose love over fear." Through her tears, Annie could see the retreat participants gathering outside the workshop, drawn by Daniel's laughter and the sound of celebration. She thought about the woman who had fled another proposal 2 years ago, convinced that marriage was just another trap that would require her to be less than she was. This felt completely different. This felt like recognition rather than compromise, like two whole people choosing to combine their strengths rather than one person trying to fill the gaps in another's life. "Yes," she said, the word coming out as a whisper first, then louder as joy overtook surprise. "Yes, of course, yes." The ring fit perfectly, and Annie realized Ephraim must have been planning this for months, working on the weather vane and the ring in secret while she'd been focused on their daily life together. The thought of his patient planning, his quiet certainty that she would say yes, filled her with warmth that had nothing to do with the mountain sunshine. As their impromptu audience burst into applause and congratulations, Annie looked around at the life they'd built, the workshop filled with evidence of creative work, the gardens producing food and medicine, the guest cabins where people came to rediscover their own strength, the mountains that had sheltered their love through its testing and its triumph. "When should we have the wedding?" Ephraim asked, still kneeling in the sawdust, despite the celebration swirling around them. Annie helped him to his feet, then stood on her toes to kiss him properly, while Daniel whistled and the retreat participants cheered from the doorway. "Tomorrow," she said against his lips. "Next month. Next year. It doesn't matter when, as long as it's here, on this mountain, with the people who understand that sometimes the best love stories start with the worst days." "And sometimes," Ephraim replied, holding her close while their community of chosen family celebrated around them, "they end with the most ordinary ones. Days when you wake up next to someone who sees you clearly and loves you anyway. Days when the work you do matters. Days when you know exactly where you belong." Annie looked out through the workshop window at the mountains that had become home, at the gardens where she grew healing for others, at the buildings where people came to remember their own capabilities. In the distance, she could see the spot where her wedding ring had disappeared into the snow 2 years ago, swallowed by the mountain that had given her everything that small circle of metal had promised but never delivered. She was no longer the woman who had stumbled through a blizzard in a torn wedding dress, convinced that love was something that happened to other people. She was no longer even the woman who had thrown that ring away in a gesture of defiant independence. She was Annie Lott, to be, teacher and healer, mountain woman and partner, to a man who had learned that the best relationships were built on shared work and mutual respect rather than need and dependency. She was someone who had discovered that home wasn't a place you found it, was a place you created through daily choices to stay, to grow, to love, even when love required courage and forgiveness and the willingness to start over as many times as necessary. As the celebration continued around them and the sun set behind the peaks that had witnessed every stage of their unlikely love story, Annie held tight to the man who had shown her that it was never too late to become who you were always meant to be, and never too late to find the love that fit you exactly as you were.